Hello, and welcome to our conversation about Denver's migrant crisis. I'm Jennifer Brown, a co-founder and reporter at the Colorado Sun. And for the past year, I've been covering stories about the more than 39,000 people so far who have arrived in Denver on buses from the southern border. Most of them are from Venezuela and are escaping poverty and political turmoil. Tonight, we're going to dig into the issue with some of the best experts we know in order to understand how Denver has managed to help tens of thousands of people and how those who've chosen to make their new lives in Colorado are doing. We begin with Yali Reinoso, who arrived in Denver less than 3 months ago in December. In her home country of Venezuela, Yali was a criminal defense attorney. She also worked to bring humanitarian aid to people who were starving, and for that was targeted as a threat by President Nicolas Maduro. She went to Colombia for 4 years until, she says, she was threatened that her name would be reported to Venezuelan authorities as a political oppositionist. So Yali, her husband, and their daughter began the journey to the United States border. Hola Yali, gracias para hablar conmigo de nuevo. Please tell us about your trek from Venezuela to the U.S. border. How did you get here?
The trek here was very traumatic. We had to cross the Dariel jungle, which is very dangerous, and there are many, many obstacles. There are plenty of rivers that are quite high, and we were witnesses to lots of dead people as well along the way. And considering that my husband has a disability on his leg, and that my daughter has a cognitive disability, the trip was quite hazardous and difficult, and it was not easy to get here.
And at one point, Yali, your daughter and your husband almost drowned, right?
Yes, that's right. We had to cross the river holding hands because the current was very, very strong. But because the river was so strong and the river was so high, our daughter got loose and she stopped holding hands with us. And it was thanks to other people that were around that we were able to save her.
And how many months did it take, Yali? How long were you walking?
Almost 2 months for us to be able to get to the US, and it wasn't easy. We also had to use the train. We had to use to get on the famous train nicknamed La Bestia, because it is known widely that Mexican drug cartels were kidnapping people that were taking the bus. So we decided to take the train. However, it wasn't easy to get on the train. We had to stay for about 15 days at a place called La Cementera because the train wouldn't make a stop. And so a lot of us gathered there and we went onto the tracks so that the train would stop. And once it did, we were able to get on it. It was not an easy ride. It was very, very cold. I saw a lady died. She froze to death on top of the train, and so she wasn't able to hold on to her daughter, who was then dropped off from the train or dropped down from the train, and who passed away as well. And while we were on the train, we lost the food that we had for my daughter. We dropped it, and at some point I had to get off of the train to fetch food, to find food. And the train started moving again, and it was leaving me, so I had to run a lot. I had to run and to run and to run until I was able to catch up with it. But I almost lost my life as well while trying to do this. And the train was not easy because my daughter was also scared of it, and it wasn't an easy. It was also a very traumatic part of the way up here.
I cannot imagine. Tell us, Yali, what happened when you got to the border in Texas, and did you apply for asylum there? And also, why Denver? Why did you come specifically to Denver?
So we came in through Ciudad Juárez. We had to cross the Rio Grande or the Rio Bravo, and it was very difficult as well. It was really, really cold, and we got there at around 7 p.m. And it was only because we were able to set a fire that we were able to stay alive during that night. And then Border Patrol didn't let us go through at that point, so that's why we spent the night as well. And at around 5 a.m. the next day, we turned ourselves in, and they kept us for a few days, and then they released us on December 24th, but only for a couple of days. Then they captured us again, and they were wanting to know where we were going and why Denver, because we had a friend in Denver who said that he could help us out to start our lives in the US once we got here. But then at some point, he turned his phone off, and we were no longer able to reach him. And that's why when the Border Patrol, caught us again, then we had to ask for refuge, and we had to ask them for assistance, and we asked them that it would be in Denver, and thanks to people in Denver, we were able to find help in a refuge, and that's why we're still here.
Acá a Denver, pues nos consiguieron un refugio y actualmente todavía estoy en el refugio.
Yali, in Venezuela, you were a criminal defense attorney. And of course, you're not able to practice law in the United States, but you've found a way to help people. You're volunteering through All Souls in Denver to help other new people to the country apply for asylum and try to get work permits. Can you talk a bit about that volunteer work that you're doing and what you're learning from other newcomers to Denver?
Yes, I used to work as an attorney in Venezuela, but I can no longer do that here in the US, and that's something that I try to make very clear, that I try to share at the very beginning with my immigrant brothers and sisters, as I call them, when we meet each other. What I do to help them instead is try to get all their documents and paperwork in order to request the asylum petition or request in order to do it, which is the number 589. And I also asked them whether they got here before or after July 31st. So that's what I do basically, is to get their papers and documents in order so that we can make the request. And I try to tell them that even if they have a certain amount of papers and documents, it doesn't mean that they fulfill all their requirements. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that that their request is going to be successful, and that they might face deportation if that is the case. And so I try to be as clear as possible with that, and I try to help them out with that request.
Thank you. And the significance of the July date, of course, is if you arrived after that date in July to the United States, under federal law, you're not eligible for the work permit. So Yali, that would include you and your husband, right? You're not able right now to apply for work authorization because you weren't here before July. And I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about, first of all, where you're living. I believe still in a city-funded hotel room. And what are your longer-term plans in terms of being able to make a living here in Colorado?
We have requested asylum because I am a political refugee, and that's one of the requirements in applying and being able to apply for asylum. And so we already presented our request, and we are waiting the 150 days that we have to stay here to then be able to apply for a job permit. And yes, we are still in this hotel room, but however, we have already started seeking housing elsewhere, and we've been getting help from other organizations, just like Papagayo and Vive, to find housing elsewhere.
Last question, please, Yali. I was just hoping that you could talk about, what's been your biggest obstacle after you've arrived in Denver? And, is it what you expected Are you glad you're here? Are you hopeful? Or, how do you feel about what's ahead now that you're trying to settle in Denver?
Muchísima la pena de estar por acá porque no vivimos con
Yes,
esa
it has been worth it. It has been worth it just because, like, the mere fact of not being persecuted and of not having a constant fear of and threat. So it's been worth it to be here. And I'd say that the greatest obstacle that we've faced has been finding work, getting a job, because there's having a sustainable job would make it easier to be able to finance our lives over here and to be able to pay for what we need to pay. However, as migrants, this is not just an obstacle for me and my family, but as migrants, it's very complicated to find a job because we don't necessarily have the documents needed. And thank God we are starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we're hopeful that we'll get work permits and we'll be able to find a job to afford a living here in the US. And this would not be possible without a job, of course. And well, yes, we've been here since December, and we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Pues apenas lo que llevamos son desde diciembre para acá. Únicamente vamos a cumplir 4 meses acá y hemos cumplido algunos objetivos que yo creo que en otro país no los fuéramos cumplir.
Thank you, Yali. Muchas gracias, Yali.
I thank you all, and apologies for my tears, but this has not been an easy process, and this is a shared experience for immigrants trying to get here. It's not just my family that suffered through getting through all the territories, through the jungle, through Mexico. It's not, some people do worse, some people do a bit better, some people lose family on their way here, some people get kidnapped, some people get raped, and so it's definitely not an easy thing to get over here, and I just wanted to share that.
Okay, we're moving on now to the next portion of our panel conversation, and I'm joined by 3 new panelists. We've got John Ewing. He's a communications specialist for Denver Human Services, which is the city agency that has really led all the emergency operations, housing, and feeding of migrants who've been traveling through Denver. We also have DJ Summers. He's Director of Policy and Research for the Common Sense Institute, which has studied the costs of this influx of newcomers. And finally, we have Candice Marley. She's the Executive Director of All Souls, and which is where Yali works to help others apply for asylum and work authorizations. And All Souls is a nonprofit that has really helped thousands of migrants over the past several months, and many of those who are living outside after they've exited the hotels. So we're going to begin this part of the panel with John. John, since December 2022, Denver has helped more than 39,000 migrants who've arrived on buses to the city, mainly from Texas. As of today, I just looked, there are about 1,600 people in city-funded hotel rooms and shelters, though that number has been as high as, above 4,500, especially during the really cold part of the winter. Denver so far has spent $59 million on this effort. So I'm hoping you can kick us off by describing how the city was able to activate this emergency response as migrants began arriving, and what it's been like for city staff to operate shelters and greet busloads of people who have sometimes arrived in the middle of the night, and I will say a few times have arrived in sort of a political stunt kind of way, like right in front of the Capitol building or other places that are not a shelter.
Yeah. First off, thank you so very much for having me. I'm a big fan of the Colorado Sun and everything you all do, so I'm thrilled to be here. We have helped around 40,000 people over the last 15 months or so. I mean, to put that in context, just that number, I mean, that's Coors Field on a Saturday night in July when the Dodgers are in town, and you look to your left, you look to your right, up and down, and almost every seat is full. That's the number of people that we've cared for over the last year. And we are down now from a high of near 5,000 to around 1,500 people just over the last couple of months, which has been an incredible effort. But it has been an incredible effort over the last year. We have always said that it is somewhat like building the plane while you're flying it. And sometimes it never feels like first class. Sometimes it feels like economy plus. And there have been days, kind of the ones you alluded to, where it felt like you were on that plane where the door got sucked out mid-flight. So it has been challenging at times, and it has been a true labor of love for all of the staff who have worked very diligently to care for people.
And as I understand it, John, I mean, staff have been pulled from various other departments to work on this effort. And if you could, just for people who don't understand how it works, like there's a initial place, like a processing center where migrants arrive, and then, what are they offered? What happens to them from that facility?
Yeah, I mean, first on the staffing component, so many of the people are people who are doing their regular 9 to 5 jobs on top of this job as well, right? So in DHS, they're still doing everything the DHS offers. They're still getting those stat benefits out to people. They're still helping with WIC. They're still helping with childhood support. They're still doing all those things, but they're also now helping with the migrant response as well. So it's been an incredible task. The Welcome Center, basically how we have this set up is we have one designated location where we take everyone to. So we can do an initial sort of health screening, so we can find out what their needs are immediately. Often clothing is an immediate need. Very often, if they're arriving on a chartered bus, the first need is, can you get me to where I actually wanted to go in the first place? Can you get me a bus ticket to any X number of cities, anywhere where they'd actually researched, have family, friends, anything along those lines, because often they didn't want to come to Denver in the first place. So that's that. And then, but if they do want to stay in Denver, that's where we assign them to which shelter they're going to be at, brief them on the whole, the gamut of things, explain how length of stay works, and then try to, even from day one, start connecting them with nonprofits so they can start thinking about long term. Obviously, they're very exhausted by the time they arrive. They've been going through a lot by the time they arrive, but we do try to start thinking about a long term plan pretty much from day one.
And you've told me before, John, and I've seen they arrive sometimes in flip flops, and it's 5 degrees outside here, so really basic needs right off the bat. In terms of you mentioned some people come to Denver maybe because that's where the bus from Texas was sending them, or they just took a ride anywhere to get more central into the country, but they don't really want to stay here. So the city will buy one-way bus tickets to other places where they may have family or friends, or that they just want to go to. And, I said we've had more than 39,000 people come through. Does the city have a handle right now on the number of bus tickets that were purchased, and, sort of getting at like how many of these nearly 40,000 people are staying in Colorado?
Yeah, so we have purchased. First off, there are folks who do come to Denver who want to stay in Denver. That is absolutely the case. I think the bus numbers kind of show all of that. But we've had around 40,000 people served, and of those, around 20,000 we purchased bus tickets for. And we can basically guess at this point from an initial bus arriving. We had 3 buses arrive over the weekend. I should put in context, I'm sure that'll be asked later. We had 7 buses over the course of February. We're at 8 for March. So it's at March 11th. So it's already ticking back up again. All right. So it's already trending in that direction. So we can pretty much bet that 40 to 60% of the folks who will arrive here by bus will want to go somewhere else immediately. They'll have a designated location in mind. It really won't be any kind of process. They'll just know exactly where they want to go. Then we try and get them there. Sometimes they do need a couple extra days to figure out what they actually want to do. They didn't really know what was going to happen once they got over to the country necessarily. We obviously provide that. And then sometimes, the bus leaves a couple days later, right? Or there's just no bus out, so we're going to put them up in shelter, take care of them for a couple of days. So there's any number of things there.
Okay. And, since you brought that up, let's talk about this like ebb and flow a little bit. I think a lot of us were startled, in December 2022, it was right around Christmas, and all of these buses started pouring in, and, we weren't really ready for that as a city. And we've seen over, the last year, there are times when, people were coming at like 200 people a day, slow down, and then it comes back up again. Talk about where we're at in that cycle, and is there any rhyme or reason to it that you guys are able to figure it out? I mean, I don't think border policy is changing, so what is the reason for those huge swings?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's any number of things. I think if you look at, say, the summer where it died down a little bit in the summer, our summers, that was because of, say, the rainy season, right? In Central and South America, the Darien Gap becomes more difficult to pass during those times. Now, the big difference is that before you wouldn't even chance it. About 10 years ago, you wouldn't even chance it. You'd say that's way too dangerous. That's not happening as much anymore. People are still taking that chance, and they're still coming over in the summer now. So even that isn't necessarily a guarantee anymore, but the numbers did drop. I think one thing that we saw, I mean, some of it is as simple as cause and effect. The border becomes overwhelmed. There's so many folks at the border, and then they come up through here. I think one thing that changed in September and October, that was when we had that enormous influx, the likes of which truly we hadn't seen before. One thing that changed was that El Paso, Texas, started taking place really in the Texas busing program and started chartering folks up to Denver as well. And for folks who don't know, I'm very bad at geography, so I definitely don't blame you for not knowing this. El Paso is only 10 hours south of Denver. It's very close, and so those buses arrive very quickly, and there's a lot of people on them. And so that was one of the big things that changed. I think we always can count on it kind of coming up and down. One thing we know is that if there's any kind of federal policy change, there's always a little bit of an initial hesitation, trepidation, and then it picks back up again in about a month. People sort of figure out how this is working, how this is going, and then it picks back up in a month. And so even when it comes down, we're always, it came down at a really advantageous time for us because we were starting to discharge folks from shelter. And so we were able to actually really focus on the people in shelter rather than worrying about 200, 300 people coming in per day. We can't always count on that happening. And so we are seeing it tick back up. The numbers this week from El Paso, we look at their dashboard the same way we look at ours. And the numbers from El Paso this week are the highest they've been since the first week of January. Now, at the same time, they are not at the level of December. They are not 8,000 people that El Paso is seeing in a single week. That's not what they're seeing. But they are the highest that they've seen since the first week of January. So we have to think about those things. We have to start preparing for those contingencies. And so you're always looking down the line. And so, yeah, I mean, we always have, one eye on what's happening today and one eye on what's happening a week from now or a month from now.
Your big boss, Mayor Mike Johnston, when he made some announcements about scaling back on some of the spending on migrant services, the numbers were definitely like headed down. So I would imagine this is particularly rough timing now that they're headed back up in March. But what the mayor announced a couple of weeks ago is that they would stop housing migrants at 4 of the 7 hotels that the city's been using to pay for those hotel rooms. And this was estimated to cut down about $60 million out of a $180 million that Denver was on track to spend in next year's budget. So tell people, like, what kind of help financially has Denver gotten from the federal government, from the state, in terms of offsetting those huge figures? And also, what happens, John, as these hotel shelters close? I think 1 per week for 4 weeks they're closing. Are people going to end up in tents? What's going to happen?
We're going to do our level best to prevent that. I think even now we see it. It's been largely successful going from 5,000 people to 1,500, but you want to prevent anybody from falling through the cracks. And unfortunately, when you are moving this fast and you're doing this much and you have nonprofits working day and night, that is going to happen. And so we're always going to redouble our efforts to make sure if someone is falling through the cracks, if someone is experiencing homelessness, we need to get out there. Okay. And we have our host teams. We need to be figuring out what we can do about this. Largely, it's been successful. You aren't seeing widespread encampment issues, but we have a number of issues that we need to work through. And I think I forgot the first part of your question. It was a good question, I know, but what was it?
I packed too much in there. I was asking how much money Denver's gotten from
Oh,
the Fed.
sorry. Yes, and state and federal. Yeah, yeah. So we've spent around $60 million to date. The state has provided around $3.5 million. But more crucially, they are also backing many of the nonprofits. A lot of their grants are what are fueling the nonprofits that are actually helping families get out of shelter and into housing. They've also provided staff, so they've been helpful. The federal government has provided around $1.6 million cash on the barrelhead, and then we've submitted reimbursements for, I believe, around $10 million, something along that. It's a long, laborious process. It takes quite a while. And it takes quite a while to hear back or anything along those lines. But yeah, I mean, still speaking of it, $60 million we've already spent. We have no idea, what this year is going to hold necessarily. We can't predict so much of it. And so there's a number of funding issues that need to be met there. And so we do continue to call on the federal government to provide more funding, not only to cities like Denver, not only to cities like Chicago, New York, but how about El Paso, Texas too, that is dealing with this head on, that they deserve more funding as well. This isn't just this isn't a blue-red issue. This is a nationwide issue, and we need to remember that. And even folks in Texas need more support as well. So, yeah.
Right. That's a good point. And I want to ask you too, John, about work permits. Huge conversation over and over, journalists here when they talk to folks who have come to town, people just want to work. And, as the rules are right now, federally, you have to have gotten here before July 31st in order to apply for a work permit, as I understand it. And I know the city has been trying to help with this. You could tell us about the clinics that you're holding to help people apply, to help people pay for these work permits, which are expensive. And I also want to ask about this, maybe a little bit out there idea, but it's definitely been brought up a few times. What if Denver didn't wait for the federal government to say, okay, you guys are eligible for work permits? Like, could the city make its own work permit process and just let people go to work?
If I didn't have to wait on the federal government, I think my job would be a lot easier, and I think the city of Denver's job would be a lot easier right now. But unfortunately, we do have to wait on the federal government here. We can't put employers or applicants out there, with a process that isn't federally approved. We can't put them at risk or anything along those lines. It's just simply out of our control. What is in our control, though, is what we can do for the folks who did come in through the CBP1 app, which is what you're referring to there. They came in through that process. Now, there's a number of issues with that app, and so there's a number of reasons that somebody might not have come in through that app. But if you did come into that app, that means you're probably paroled to the country. That means you almost certainly are eligible for work authorization. And so what we've been able to do is we've been able to stand these clinics up, screen people first so we're not wasting anyone's time. Make sure they came in through that, make sure they're eligible, get them into a clinic. And we have, with this is including, a couple of state-backed clinics, a couple of nonprofit-backed clinics, but 1,600 people that have gotten through that in the last 3 weeks. So that's 1,600 people who can now apply for a job, stand on their own 2 feet, take care of themselves. So that's an enormous accomplishment. And so many people, I haven't gotten to shout them out in any other way, so I get to shout them out here. But thank you, Little India, for feeding all of the volunteers and everyone else. Providing 600 meals on that first day, being so kind and so sweet. But we've had so many great people come in and show up and help. But that's what it's all about. The big issue we have is for the folks who aren't work authorization. Sorry. Folks who aren't eligible for work authorization. That's the big obstacle, and I think that's one of the things you see here in Denver is you see folks out there squeegeeing windows, trying to make $10 a day, working 10 hours a day. And that's, it's heartbreaking. And what's happening there is, I think what, we've run into is, I think everyone knows there's a certain number of kind of below below the table jobs in any city. There's a certain number of day labor jobs in any city. But now we have so many of those folks are now all competing for those same jobs here in Denver. They're all competing for the same jobs, and there's only so many of them. So we're working with those, with them. But right now, we do want to say it's been an incredible achievement to get 1,600 people through those clinics. And kudos to the federal government, in this case, the Biden administration, for expediting that work permit process. Used to take months to get your permit in the mail. Now it's a matter of weeks. So that all of that is an achievement.
Yeah, there's definitely some bright spots in there. And I also want to ask you, John, I think last question for you right now. I've heard the mayor speak passionately about Denver's spirit as a sanctuary city. I just want to read this quote to you guys because I think it's a big quote. Denver has been and will be the most vibrant city in the state for decades to come, and it will be because we will be a place that's welcoming to folks who want to come help build it into something better. We will bet our future on that. Other folks want to bet their future on closing doors. We'll see who wins. That was Mayor Johnston. So other cities, he's referring to Colorado Springs, Aurora, Lakewood, they've made it pretty darn clear that they do not want to help migrants, that their cities are closed to people coming up from the border. I'm wondering if the mayor himself or city council people or other city leaders have tried to ask other towns in Colorado to step up. Like, why is this only a Denver problem?
You went through a lot there. First off, I will note that we don't refer to ourselves as a sanctuary city. We've always referred to ourselves as a welcoming city. Sanctuary city at this point is a term that's so broad and political as so much as to mean nothing. We've always said welcoming city. That's how we feel, and I think that's what we represent. We are a welcoming city. We've always been a welcoming city. We're going to continue to be a welcoming city. And other cities' business is their prerogative. But at the end of the day, we have had conversations with other cities in Colorado. We have asked for regional support. We continue to ask for regional support because we continue to believe this is a regional issue. Folks are not going to necessarily just stay in Denver once they leave shelter. And that's kind of the part of the question that I didn't answer for you earlier, and I wish that I had, and I think about it now, is that, yes, I can say 20,000 people wanted a ticket somewhere else in the country. What I can't tell you is how many people left shelter, decided to stay in Denver for a bit, and then said, this isn't working. This city is way too expensive. This isn't work. I can't find a job here. And how many of us have been through that same thing, right? Where we've come to Denver, we thought we were going to Denver, and you actually end up living somewhere else, right? Because that's where you can afford a home. That's where you find your job. And that's going to happen. That's going to continue happening. And so this idea that people are going to be bused to one of 3 Democratic, led cities, and they're just going to stay there is ridiculous. For one thing, they may have researched an entirely different city. They may have family in Miami. Or in general in Colorado, they may say that place seems nice. There are great people in every city in Colorado. There are great nonprofits who want to support and want to help. We're not pushing them anywhere in Colorado, but I think it's only natural that folks are going to look for where is the best apartment, where's the best deal, where can I get the most bang for my buck.
Right. Yeah, that won't be stopped. People will filter where they go. So thank you, John. I'm going to move on to DJ from the Common Sense Institute. And DJ, you recently authored a report. I think it was published last month, and you found that the cost of this influx of newcomers is far higher than what's been calculated by the city, more than that $60 million. And this is because you're looking at migrants not just using these city funded shelters and food, but also the healthcare system, going to the hospital, enrolling in public schools and other services provided around Colorado and Denver. So let's break it down and talk about the healthcare piece first, and specifically tell us what you found looking into migrant care at Denver Health.
Absolutely. And it's like you say, there are more costs than just what's absorbed at the city level. There are institutions within the city and around the city that need to put forward their own funding in order to accommodate what spillover happens at their level. Healthcare is one of the primary ones. Denver Health has reported at least 10 million in uncompensated care that they estimate has been spent on care for these migrants. Now, they don't ask at the Denver Health level for every visit, are you a citizen, are you here? That's one of their capacities is a provider of charity care. That is an estimate, but that only encompasses a 3-month period as I understand it, and that number is a few months older by now. So we're actively looking to get additional numbers from Denver Health and from some of the other city healthcare facilities. This is also not just a Denver specific issue. The report that I authored focused solely on what was happening in Denver proper. Other healthcare facilities are having the same impact. If you examine UC Health and their spending, they estimate about 17 million in uncompensated care for migrants. Now, UC Health does not have a single facility inside Denver proper. So we know that to some extent, there are other healthcare facilities, other hospitals outside of Denver proper that are absorbing some of the spillover effect. So if you tally all of those up together just from those two hospital systems, the cost is about $30 million in uncompensated care for migrants in the Denver metro. We're looking to arrive at more recent numbers that more fully encompass the rest of the hospital system in the Denver metro right now.
And I think what we're talking about, DJ, when it comes to healthcare, I mean, people who don't have insurance in general often will show up at the emergency department, right? Like that's like the point of entry where you won't be turned away. And that's also the most expensive type of healthcare in the emergency department. So I think that that is a lot of the costs that you're referring to.
It is. A lot of the costs with uncompensated care are specifically because of that. Uncompensated care is exactly that. It's uncompensated. Providers cannot recoup any of the costs for provision that they dole out with any of this care. This is why institutions like Denver Health exist, so that they can be a designated provider for charity care for people who don't have other means. Now, they have a limited income stream from the city of Denver, from whatever grants that they are established. So it's stretching previously agreed upon divisions of their funding. It is stressing every dollar that used to be projected to go to a designated purpose is having to be diverted and go elsewhere. So their staffing and their supplies that used to be projected to go just to what was here in Denver before this situation came out is just being eaten up by additional costs.
Right. Okay. Let's turn our attention to talk about schools for a minute. We've all seen Denver Public Schools is saying that it's received an estimated 3,400 migrant children over the past year. And I know this is happening at a smaller scale, but it's happening at other school districts too. A recent story I wrote about, the small number of migrants who have settled in Colorado Springs. I reached out to several school districts in El Paso County, and one of them had maybe 50 new children. But talk about, DJ, like what this will cost and how does Colorado end up paying for that?
So there's a couple ways to estimate how much Denver Public Schools is going to pay. And you're right, there is a spillover effect. They're not all landing in Denver Public Schools. The 3,400 that have landed in Denver Public Schools is just what's landed there. We don't know what's been what's accumulated in Aurora Public Schools or in Jeffco or in Dougco or any of the other big metro school districts, Cherry Creek. This is just focused on Denver Public Schools. Now, they get at the district level a certain portion of state funding for every single student that they matriculate before October 1st of any given year. So there's the difference between how much they're going to need to pay for every student versus how much they've received from the state to pay for each of those students. So there's two different estimates, and it's between 26 million and 48 million. That 48 million is what they will have to pay in instruction and support for those 3,400 students. That's from a previous Common Sense Institute estimate of instruction and student spending or instruction and classroom spending per student, about $14,000 per student. So it's a difference between how much they have in shortfall versus how much they will absolutely be on the hook to pay, which is close to 50 million if you use that estimate. And again, we're talking, it's similar to uncompensated care. This is a section of the student population that will probably need additional resources. They're going to need additional linguistic support because they're second English language learners. English is a second language. They're going to need additional social support. They're going to need maybe additional transportation support. And these are not the same kinds of students that Denver Public Schools has previously matriculated and projected for. This is a different subset of the population that's really going to stretch those dollars out.
And DJ, I forgot to ask at the beginning, like, what's your big number? Like, what was the big calculation that you came up with in terms of how much all of these newcomers are costing?
So if we block those three things together, the spending that has happened at the city level, the spending that has happened in education, and the spending that has happened in healthcare, according to what they have all, by mid-February, said they've spent, it's between $78 and $100 million worth of spending. Now, I'm going to be working to update that figure because the city has updated its spending figures, and we're going to get additional reports from the school system, additional reports from other healthcare facilities, both in and outside of Denver, to try to get a broader citywide picture that's more up to date here in the next few weeks.
It's like so many millions of dollars, like my brain doesn't really compute it anymore, but it's a lot of millions of dollars. And just finally, DJ, if you could just answer this question that a reader sent in for this conversation tonight. What does the price of all this mean for Coloradans, who are already here? And this person's particularly worried about, our chronically homeless that already existed and veterans. How do we afford everything that we've been paying for?
To a certain extent, I think John would be able to answer some of that because he knows how it's spent and delegated at a city level. But broadly speaking, there's a lot of overlap in how these migrants are funded for and how they're cared for and the services that are doled out for our unhoused population and for veterans, which has a lot of overlap itself internally. It's a lot of the city services for shelter space, a lot of the city services for veterans, food, transportation, social services to secure maybe work training, work permits. Those items are all delegated to John's division and other divisions, as well as the associated nonprofits here. And they've, for the large part, projected their spending according to what was here before this situation began. So it's going to stress a lot of those services. They're going to need to spend on an unpredicted spending category. They're going to need to spend on something that they hadn't accounted for, because who could have accounted for it? The situation is in a lot of ways like the COVID pandemic. We don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know how much better or worse it's going to get. We simply know that in the meantime, while it's happening, it is going to cost us.
Right. Okay. Thank you, DJ. I'm going to move on to Candice. Hi, Candice. Thanks for waiting patiently. So you're among the people who have been involved in this huge grassroots effort to help people who have come to Denver, including some people who have ended up living in tents after they've run out of time in these city-funded hotel rooms. And, you work with All Souls, as I mentioned before, and you've helped coordinate efforts to get people tents to sleep in, warm clothes, food, especially at an encampment off of Tower Road on the northeast side of the city. I have seen the Facebook networks where people, and there are multiple ones where people will just say, hey, these people need hot food, or, in the really freezing temperatures that we had earlier this winter, they needed water that wasn't frozen and propane heaters. And it's just amazing to watch, even just in real time in Facebook, where someone puts in a request and people are just counting on it, and they've got food and mittens delivered, within the hour. So tell us what you're seeing out there on the ground in these camps, and, these time limits on the hotel rooms. Those time limits were put on pause when it was really cold, but as we've discussed, not anymore. And people have a certain amount of days in a hotel room before they have to exit. And if they don't have a apartment to go to, they are sometimes going outside. So what are you seeing out there right now?
Yeah, thank you. We see people who have timed out of hotels and have no options. A good example is yesterday when we do outreach. So we do outreach to tent campers and then also to the hotels along Tower Road. So when we were doing outreach yesterday, we had a total of 4 families, 15 children in total, who have no options this week. So they were inquiring about camp equipment. So our job is, if people are living outside, which they are, many, to not leave them unsheltered. We feel like that's extremely cruel and inhumane. People are laying on mattresses outside without anything. So we get them all the gear they need to be properly winterized in the winter. Heaters, propane, making sure they have access to an ongoing kitchen in the camp, warm clothing, warm layers, all of that.
You mentioned, Candice, 4 or 5 families being exited this week. Denver is used to seeing people who are homeless in our city, but what we're not used to seeing is children who are homeless. And it's really, a shocking and surprising thing to see in these encampments. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Are these kids getting enrolled in school, or, are they out there only for a couple of days and get into some housing, or what is happening, especially with the kids?
When we run the camps that we run, our first goal is to assess their needs. Sometimes they do want to move on to other cities, or sometimes they're 902 and they're like, I need to go to Dallas. So we make sure they know that's available to them and coordinate that with them. Others, like John mentioned, want to stay. They don't have the ability to move into housing right away. They don't have jobs yet. So for instance, like our guys in camp, we got them work boots and construction hats and construction vests. And we teach them to go out to all the construction sites and ask every single day. And when they do that, they do get work. They do get day labor work. They just need to be pointed in the right direction. But with the kids, yeah, it's a problem. If they don't have a safe place to go night after night that's reliable and is not changing every couple weeks, there's no ability as a parent to enroll your child in school. You don't know if you're going to be on Tower Road. You don't know if you're going to be downtown. So it's super heartbreaking to see all these kids going uneducated because they don't have a place to land night after night.
Right. They don't have an address. And Candice, you and others, you've talked to officials, I think on city council and the mayor's office, about a safe camp zone. And I was hoping you could describe, like, what do you mean by that, a safe camp zone? And, what do you see in terms of these camps getting cleaned up, or swept by city crews?
Yeah, that's a problem. If they're unsanctioned, they get swept all the time. So they're always starting over at step 1. So right now we are working on pursuing a temporary managed community permit, which would be similar to something you see at like St. Francis, where the tents are properly spaced, they have heaters. So we have started that process, and that's what we will continue to do until we get the temporary camp zone. The problem is it just is a long process. We're probably really looking at 3 to 6 months, and there are people outside now. So we kind of have both going. We're trying to, a safe camp zone has access to porta potties, access to hand washing stations. They have heaters, they have propane, the tents themselves are properly winterized. They have access to food on a regular basis, and then they have access to people who are working to case manage them, whether that's getting them enrolled in school if we know they're going to be there for a number of months, or connecting them with jobs. So that's our goal. I think the city is also pursuing something similar, the permitting department said, but I don't know the specifics on that. So we do need it. We need it not only for the migrants. I think the migrants are our first step, but we need it for our unhoused populations as well, because we just have to face it. People are going to be living in tents. There's no way around it. Not everybody has jobs. Not everyone can sustain apartments. And so if they're going to be outside, we need to properly manage them.
Okay. And I do know what you mean about the camp cleanups. There over the winter when it was very cold, and I was trying to write about a specific group of guys from Venezuela, mainly, who were living in a tent encampment up by the Coliseum. Over the course of trying to write this story, I think they were moved like 3 times, and it was, like you said, it was really difficult because they were just trying to keep warm with propane and, hot soup that people were bringing into them. And then they'd have to like pack everything up and move. And, they usually only moved like a few blocks away, but it was still, was a lot. And I'm not saying I know what the solution is there, but I do see what you're talking about. I think to kind of wrap up this panel, I'll start with Candice, but I want to ask you all the same question, really. It seems like, the mayor has said that, only a fraction of people are ending up homeless. And I do think that's true. And that, most people are being able to find some work and assimilate into Denver if they decide to stay here. I guess I'm asking, is that true? And also, I've heard some people say, including people who have done the most work to help with shelter and food and all of these things, they're now starting to say, like, the message needs to get out that Denver's full. Denver doesn't have, the resources are pretty much tapped out. And, maybe this spreads by word of mouth to people who are traveling up from Venezuela and other countries. But is that how you feel, I guess, at this point? Do you feel that it's time to send that message that Denver is full, or does that contradict with, us being a welcoming city, as John put it? Candice, why don't you answer that one first?
Yeah,
please?
so on my dad's side, I'm a second generation U.S. citizen. My grandfather came over in a banana boat hidden from Brazil. So I agree that very few are falling through the cracks and ending up on the street. I think the majority are assimilating. I think others just need a little more time. I'm opposed to saying Denver is full, because then where do they go? I'm opposed to busing them to other cities if they don't have a plan in place in that city. I feel like we can do it. When we request donations or we ask to stock a camp, we get so many donations in that we can't even house them. We've had to get storage unit after storage unit. So I think if the city leaned more into the grassroots and nonprofit sector, that they could help not have to burden themselves with all the cost, and some of the nonprofits can pick up some of the cost. I know we can in terms of food, clothing, and winterized tents.
DJ, you want to take that one too?
So I don't have the on-the-ground view to answer the first portion of that question. But as to the second part of the question, I think it's clear that the situation is stretching the city's resources and its institutions' resources. That money needs to come from somewhere, and those resources need to come from somewhere. If we're going to continue with this situation, we're going to need to find some way to bridge that funding gap. I mean, we already live in a Denver metro area that has a sustained housing shortage. Introducing more people into those homes while we have a pre-existing shortage. To say Denver is full kind of already states the ongoing situation that we have too few housing units in the Denver metro area to support the population that was here before this situation began. But as far as full, unable to accept more, that's just going to depend on whether or not we can sustain the funding necessary in order to accommodate them however we can. That is the most important question here, because as it stands right now, this is a market drain on several city and its institutions' resources.
John.
Thank you. First off, I'd like to say quickly, just circle back and say, I haven't gotten to meet Candice before, but I wanted to say thank you for all the work you're doing. I really greatly appreciate your work out there with that population. I will also say that I agree. I do believe that largely this has been a success getting people out of shelter and into housing. But one child on the streets of Denver is too many. Full stop. We will make sure that we double back. The people of Denver do not want to see children on their streets. It is not going to be tolerated, period. So we will double back and we will make sure that that is being addressed if that happens with any family. And then the last thing I'll say is I think what we have to do is we have to consider the whole picture, as fictional President Jed Bartlett would say, see the whole board. And I think we have to look at the fact of how do we take care of the people that we have in our shelters right now in a way that makes sense, right? So where do we put our efforts? Where do we put our resources? So right now we're getting families largely out of shelter into homes. The nonprofits are doing a lot of that work, but they only have so much money. We only have so much money. There's only so much money to go around. So right now, the goal for right now is ensuring that of the people that are arriving, that we are getting them out of shelter and getting them into somewhere better. Even better, if they don't have to keep their whole full shelter time, right? If they're leaving a week early, if they're leaving 10 days early for that new apartment, that's 10 fewer days that the city's paying for. So we're trying to work through that population as best we can. We haven't said we're full, anything along those lines, but what we have communicated over and over and over again, and we will continue to communicate over and over again, is our limitations. The resources we have. You know, you mentioned the Welcome Center at the very beginning. One of the very first things we tell people is this is how many days we have in shelter. This is how many you'll have if you're an individual without kids. This is how many you'll have if you're a family. We really need you to work with the nonprofits. Not that you don't care already, not that you wouldn't try, but we need you to know that we really do only have this many resources to give and to spend. So I think we're going to continue communicating that. But right now, what we're busy focusing on is how do we get all of these people out of shelter, and how do we address the next wave of folks that are coming in?
Okay. Thank you, all of you, for the work that you do. And thank you for such a thoughtful conversation for this panel. And thanks to our Colorado Sun readers and supporters. You can read our past coverage of the migrant crisis at coloradosun.com, of course. And the Colorado Sun is a member of the Trust Project. You can read about what that means and see our commitment to trusted journalism at coloradosun.com/ethics. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.